Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's great to have the opportunity to present you today as we draw to the conclusion of what has been a very productive and successful year for our company. The AGM provides a great opportunity to look back on some of the key achievements of the year, but I also want to spend the bulk of the next 20-30 minutes looking ahead to some of the grounds we see for excitement in the next year or two of the company's evolution. We think that we really stand at a pivotal moment in Kazia's development, and that's reflected both in the evolution of our pipeline and the dramatic steps we've been taking forward with Paxalosib. But I want to talk primarily today about what the future holds for our company, but I also want to reflect a little bit on some of the key developments and achievements of the year that we've almost completed. So to begin with, these are really the highlights, at least for me, over the last 12 months or so. And I think we have to put at the top of that list the 3 partnering transactions that the company has completed in calendar 2021, respectively, the out-license of Cantrixil to Erasmia, the out-license for the China rights of Paxalosib to Simcere, and then in April of this year, the in-licensing of EVT-001 from Evotec. Collectively, these transactions are completely transformative for Kazia. We emerge at the end of 2021 a very different company from the company that began the year, one with a diversified clinical stage pipeline, very high quality assets. And that really positions us fantastically well for the years ahead. And indeed, that's reflected in the financial position of the company, where we've seen in FY21 $15 million of revenue brought to book, and the lion's share of that has been through these partnering transactions. To be clear, we still see Kazia as a pre-revenue company, and our revenue over the next couple of years will be lumpy, and it will be driven primarily by partnering milestones and by events of that sort. But I think there's 2 important messages that come out for shareholders here. One is that the company is increasingly demonstrating the ability to monetize its assets. This is not something that lies in the distant future and is entirely contingent on clinical trial results. We are already generating value from these assets. And that value is substantial because, in particular, the transaction we completed with Simcere was really just for a territory that represents somewhere between 8 and 10% of the global market opportunity for Paxalosib. And the value that that company has put on the drug, up to $281 million in contingent milestones, really speaks very favorably to the potential economics of future partnering transactions for Paxalosib. So I think we can take great reassurance that these financial developments really herald great value ahead for the drug as it moves through its clinical development. And indeed, that clinical development continues to be exceptionally busy. We currently have 11 clinical trials ongoing within Kazia across both the Paxalosib and EVT-001 programs. As the chairman has referred to in previous years, that is a pipeline that would be the envy of a much larger company. And it really reflects, I think, both the ingenuity we've been able to bring to the development of these assets, but also the degree of interest among clinicians. And that's a point I want to return to in a few minutes. And indeed, that progress has been reflected, as you've heard, in the financial performance of the company in the stock market. $1 invested in Kazia on June the 30th of 2020 would have been worth $2.79 on June the 30th, 2021. And now share price is a lagging indicator, frankly, but I think this really starts to demonstrate the increasing recognition of the company's value among the investment community. And indeed, we are now a phase 3 company. We are genuinely a late-stage clinical development company with the transition of Paxalosib into the GBM Agile study at the beginning of this year. And but that is not the only thing that's been going on with Paxalosib. We've started 3 new clinical trial collaborations this year, each of which bring a different angle to the drug, a different way of looking at it, a different opportunity to understand more about it and to bring it to a wider group of patients. So we've continued to expand the clinical trial program as we've been taking it forward into phase 3. And there are now to date more than 200 patients that have been treated with paxiloside in that clinical trial program, really starting to amass a very substantial body of data about the drug. And this is really as it should be as we head rapidly towards a marketing authorization. And then finally, of course, EVT-801, now in a phase 1 clinical trial, a clinical stage asset, the first patient already receiving drug in that trial, and I think really puts us on a very interesting track with that drug, which again, we'll talk more about in the rest of this presentation. I'm going to make a few comments now about the company's financial performance, and I want to start by speaking briefly to the company's share price performance. As you can see on this chart, which covers the period from 1st of July 2020 to 30th of June 2021, a dollar invested in the S&P ASX 200 would have made a 23% return. The NASDAQ Biotech Index actually underperformed that. It returned about 19% over the same period. The small cap biotech index did rather better, about a 31% return. Sad to say that's reversed a little bit in the second half of calendar 2021. It's been a tough second half for smaller cap biotech companies. But over the same period, as I touched on earlier, $1 invested in Kazia will have returned $1.79 in profit. And this really, as I say, reflects an increasing level of interest both among professional investors and among retail investors in the prospects of the company. However, the measure that we prefer to follow, I think that we find often much more instructive, is the metric of enterprise value. And we spoke about this a little bit last year. In brief, this is a measure of the company's value minus the cash on the balance sheet. And in this metric, we've increased by value approximately 37 times in the last 5 years or so. We've seen the value of the company increase from negligible enterprise value in 2016 to about $140, $150 million at June 2021. And this is important because this really reflects the valuation that the market places, not on the cash at the bank, but on the pipeline of the company, on its capabilities, on its brand, on its team, on its ability to generate value from these assets. And I think this really tells, I think, a much more interesting story about the progress of the company over recent years. And we've focused a lot on sustainable shareholder value. We don't want to see Kazia become one of those stocks that just moves up and down at random in the market, but without any net progress for shareholders. And so we've really worked hard to make sure that the money that investors have put into the company is backed by operational achievements in the company. And that's reflected a little bit in the operating cash flows that you see here. Very roughly speaking, for every dollar of the $42 million that shareholders have put into the company over the last 5 years, we've been able to approximately match that with $1 of operating income from the ongoing operations of the business. Now, some of that comes through the Australian federal government's R&D tax rebate, but a good part of it, particularly in recent years, through partnering transactions, through an IP settlement with another company. And so we've really managed to leverage the contribution from our investors with clear early operational achievements in the company. And we really think this is a very solid foundation on which to build the company's value as we move forward. And finally, I think these achievements have been recognized among professional investors and a good proxy for this is the analyst interest that is focused on the company. We are at the moment covered by 5 equity research analysts, as you can see, roughly half and half between Australia and the United States. 2 of these are sponsored research. That's ubiquitous for companies at our size in the market. But also we have several stockbrokers and investment banks that are now following us independently. And as you can see from the price targets shown at the bottom of the page here, all of these analysts are unanimous in their perspective that there is significant value appreciation opportunity for the company ahead. And so we think this is an encouraging sign that our company is in good health and that health is increasingly recognized by professional investors. One of the most important things we've turned our minds to over the past 12 months has been an increasing focus on the commercial prospects for Paxlovid. As the chairman has alluded to, this drug is now potentially within a couple of years of a marketing authorization. And so we need to be thinking very carefully about the commercial prospects for Paxlovid. And so to that end, earlier this year, we commissioned some primary market research through a consulting firm in the United States. And this is work where consultants have gone out and spoken to clinicians and to payers very specifically about Paxlovid. They've asked questions directly about our drug to understand its potential reception in the market following a successful phase 3 study. And I wanted to share some of that data today because I think it really is quite interesting in terms of how it points to the prospects for Paxlovid. The first thing we see here on the left side of the slide is a broad question around the unmet need in glioblastoma. You've all heard me speak about the paucity of available drug treatments here, but it's very important to have that perspective confirmed by clinicians who are on the front line of patient care. And indeed it is. On a 7-point scale, the clinicians consider that the unmet need in glioblastoma is 6.7. It's extremely high. And you can see some of the comments here that represent the sentiment here. There are almost no drugs available for these patients. There is a desperate need for new therapies. And that's a message that came through very loud and clear in our market research. When we put to them a drug with the profile of Paxlovid, its mechanism of action and so on, we see again a very, very favorable perspective. On a 7-point scale, 5.1 as the average rating from the 15 clinicians that we spoke to in the United States. And again, some representative commentary here. This is a very, very powerful endorsement of the drug. It really reflects the appetite for clinicians for progress in this disease, but also for the specific profile that Paxlovid brings to the disease area. So on the basis of this, we've turned to address the question of uptake. Of course, it's one thing to have a great drug. It's another thing if that drug is left on the shelf. And we asked, first of all, the question of what does success look like for a new drug in glioblastoma? In the newly diagnosed unmethylated patient group, which you may recall is the primary group we've been looking at, it's the patient population that we've examined in our phase 2 study. The ideal result for clinicians, the gold medal, the home run, would be a survival benefit of approximately 7 months. That is every dream of the clinician community come true. And the minimum benefit that's likely to be of substantial interest to clinicians is somewhere more around 2.6 months. And again, these are average figures, but they give us a sense of the range of what clinicians would be looking to see from Paxlovid in the final data from GBM Agile. I would say, just as a caveat, it's very tempting to compare these figures with the data we've already reported from our phase 2 study. That study, to be candid, is not really designed to answer this question. It's not a large enough or precise enough question to really quantify the benefit of Paxlovid. We need to wait for GBM Agile to really put a number to that. But that study certainly gives us some positive pointers and a point of reference here. If Paxlovid achieves these results, well, if it achieves the minimum benefit of 2.6 months here, we asked the clinicians how many of their patients would they use the drug on, and the figure that came back was 84%. If it achieves something closer to the optimal figure here of 7 months, that figure rises to 94% adoption. As I say, to be clear, this is data very specific to Paxlovid based on asking 15 practicing neuro-oncologists and medical oncologists what they would actually do if this drug was available to them. And I will say that in 20 years of working in the pharmaceutical industry, these are the highest adoption forecasts I've ever seen for a drug. I think it really speaks very pointedly to the enormous demand in this disease area for new therapies. This is a drug that, if it's successful, will walk off the shelves, that will be very widely prescribed by clinicians. And I think what's really encouraging here as well is that even if the final results from GBM Agile do come in at the lower end of expectations, the adoption is still incredibly positive. 84% is still an an amazing uptake for any new pharmaceutical product. When we look at the recurrent disease setting, which we're also examining in GBM Agile, we do see similar figures here. About 2.1 months as really the threshold of interest for clinicians, and 4.8 months as their optimal outcome. And in this area, adoption moves from 55% to 80% in that range. Slightly lower figures, which just reflect, among other things, the existence of Avastin there, and the fact that this is a more complex disease area. Within the recurrent group, there are second and third and even fourth line patients, but still incredibly favorable results. So I think we've been very heartened by the feedback that this is a drug for which there will be exceptionally high demand in the market. This leads to a question around pricing, and I would say here first of all that as a general observation, the median price at launch for a new oncology therapy in the United States, as of 2018, which is the last data for which we have good quality data available, was $148,000 US per year of treatment, roughly about $12,000 per month. And that's a median across the entire industry. Obviously, many therapies retailing for very much more than that, some for a little less. But that's a good benchmark. And in general, we don't expect Paxlovid to be certainly priced at any sort of discount to the average. We see this as a highly competitive therapy that should really be commanding, if anything, a premium price point. And as we look at individual comparisons, we look at Avastin, which I mentioned was approved in the United States for recurrent disease. That sells at about $13,000 a month. Optune, a medical device that was approved a few years ago for recurrent glioblastoma, again about the same price point. And then the remaining 4 bars you see there are investigational therapies, and this is based on analyst expectations for their price point. And then for reference, you see on the right there 3 immuno-oncology therapies that are used for a range of cancers. They give us a good benchmark for novel cutting-edge cancer drugs, pembrolizumab, atezolizumab, and nivolumab there. And certainly everything points to some sort of price point within about the $12,000 to $15,000 per month range. And obviously that represents very favorable economics for Paxlovid. And again, these aren't just industry-wide comparison points. We went out and asked the question specifically to payers in both the United States and the European Union. And for those that are unfamiliar with the technology, payers are the gatekeepers, really, for any new pharmaceutical therapy. In the United States, it's a mixture of insurers and government bodies such as Medicare and Medicaid. And in the European Union, generally more government-weighted. By comparison, in Australia, we have effectively a monopsony payer, which is the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme. Now, when we ask the question in the United States, we see as we raise the hypothetical price of Paxlovid, we have very strong support right through almost all the way to $20,000 a month. Only really at that sort of threshold that the willingness to pay by payers starts to diminish. As we look in the European Union, we always see lower price points there. Typically, drugs sell for about half to 2/3 the price in the European Union that they do in the United States. But again, very strong support up to certainly $9,000, even $10,000. And again, this is incredibly positive data. I think this really speaks to a very receptive market for our drug, should it successfully clear its phase 3 study. And so I think coming out of this, we take great confidence that we have a drug which is very commercially viable. I think we don't have any qualms that should Paxlovid be successful, we will be able to really deliver this drug to patients and really generate value for the company. I'm going to talk briefly now about the competitive landscape for Paxlovid, and I'm just going to make some general comments here. And of course, when we think about competition, we have to consider it partly in terms of the likely approval timeframes for Paxlovid. And I've touched on that in this slide. Very, very broadly, we are starting to work around the assumption of a base case with final data from GBM Agile somewhere in the middle of calendar 2023. Now, I want to say this is a working hypothesis. This is indicative. This has a wide range of variability around it at this stage. As long-term shareholders will know, this is an adaptive study. The number of patients it recruits is variable. But we still have to start making assumptions. For planning purposes, that's the assumption we're relying on. And that would see the drug approved potentially towards the end of calendar 2023, more likely in the early part of calendar 2024. And so when we think about the competitive landscape, we think in that context of drugs that could be approaching approval within that sort of time frame. And certainly when we look at through that lens, glioblastoma is perhaps one of the least competitive cancers in the entire spectrum of the disease. This chart shows most of the most common cancers along the x-axis. You see the number of FDA-approved products. On the y-axis, the number of clinical trials ongoing. And both these scales are inverted. So cancers in the top right corner are those with the least competitive intensity. Those in the bottom left are the most competitive. And the red ball here shows glioblastoma, as you can see, with the exception of cervical cancer, which we expect to substantially disappear in the developed world over coming decades, thanks to the cervical cancer vaccine. Glioblastoma is one of the least competitive cancers available. I say that with no great relish or satisfaction. I think this is really speaks to the challenge faced by clinicians and their patients. But it does really point to the fact that Paxalosib will launch into really an almost completely open market. So I've shown here some of the programs in the global pipeline that we track carefully. And you can see Paxalosib at the top of the list here. The next two items, Regorafenib and Val-083, are our two fellow drugs in the GBM Agile clinical trial. They're both being tested alongside us in that study. And then I won't go through line by line all these projects, but we get a clear sense of some of the trend in the global pipeline. Mostly small molecule targeted therapies in the late stage pipeline, and that's a category to which Paxalosib belongs. A certain amount of interest around cancer vaccine approaches and the like in the slightly behind that. Northwest Biotherapeutics DC-Vax, perhaps the top of the list there, although it's a drug that's been in development for quite some years. Generally, this has not been a fantastically fruitful approach for glioblastoma. We know that the immune system in the brain behaves very differently to the rest of the body. And so we're seeing really an increasing focus on immune stimulant agents. You can see here, including the Dimecon Sumitomo and ERC programs. And then as we get towards the back of the list, some interesting opportunities in gene therapy that we've been tracking as well. But in general, I'd make the comment that really none of these drugs, in our mind, represent a material competitive threat for Paxalosib. In almost every cancer we look at, there are multiple drugs in development. What tends to happen is they're used together. We're interested here in drugs which would potentially take away market from Paxalosib, which would make the drug redundant, really make it less useful for clinicians and for patients. And we see nothing on this list that really represents that sort of competitive threat. And I just want to expand on that point because I think it's a crucial thing to understand about the pharmaceutical industry in general. The pharmaceuticals has a very different kind of competitive dynamics from almost any other industry. And I'm going to illustrate that with two examples. First of all, breast cancer. And you can see here the breast cancer global market in 2017. This was about a $12.5 billion commercial market made up of multiple categories. The dark blue part here shows HER2 inhibitors, mainstay of treatment in this disease, and then several other categories of drugs stacked on top of that. Now, between 2017 and 2020, we saw multiple new therapies approved. Tucatinib, an orally available HER2 inhibitor, really a revolutionary therapy for this disease. Two new CDK4 inhibitors, abemaciclib and ribociclib, to add to palbociclib, which is the blue section of the bar on the left. And then a whole new category of PARP inhibitors, and of course the first PI3K inhibitor in breast cancer, alpelisib. One might say, well, goodness, does this really cannibalize the market? Does this take away from all those existing therapies in 2017? The answer is no. The market actually grew by about 40%. All of these therapies added to the existing classes. And in fact, really the only class within breast cancer that saw any significant decrease in market was hormonal therapies, and this is really a trend that's been going on for some years now. Similar story in lung cancer, about an $8 billion market in 2017. Massive flurry of activity over the last few years. No less than 3 immuno-oncology drugs, checkpoint inhibitors, the dark blue drugs approved here. 2 ALK inhibitors. This is really that adds to 3 existing therapies, fighting over about 2% of lung cancer patients. Instead of seeing cannibalization, what we actually see is a doubling in size of the lung cancer market and substantial growth across all these categories. Even EGFR inhibitors, the light blue category here, which hasn't really seen substantial new changes in the pipeline, has also more than doubled in size as we've seen these new therapies come on. So I really just give these examples to point to the very unique competitive dynamics in pharmaceuticals. As we see new drugs approved, they typically extend the use of existing drugs. They are typically additive, at least in the short term. And so we believe the future of glioblastoma looks somewhat similar. It looks like multiple drugs that will be used by clinicians in combination for different patients as they need to. And that's the case in just about every other form of cancer. That's what we expect to happen here. I'm going to speak now finally about EVT-801. And of course, as our shareholders will recall, in April of this year, we licensed EVT-801 in from Evotec, a European drug development company. And very pleased to report that just last week, that drug commenced its phase 1 clinical trial. And I've spoken before about the important watershed this represents for any drug in development. Fundamentally, we are in the business of treating human patients. And so when we first start putting the drug into human patients, it's really the point where the drug starts the important part of its development. And EVT-801 has now begun that journey, and we'll be very excited to share information as it progresses. And again, we've touched on before the fact that EVT-801 really enters a slightly different space from Paxilosib. It enters a field of angiogenesis drugs, which is already has a substantial number of participants. You can see some of the key drugs listed here on this slide. Avastin, as we've noted before, perhaps the dominant drug in the class, even 15 years after its approval, with a $7 billion plus in annual sales, but a range of other therapies that have come in behind that, each of which have unique features and unique profiles. And of course, as we spoke about at the time of bringing EVT-801 in, the challenge in this space is twofold. Despite this rich field of drugs, all of them, by cutting off the blood supply to the tumor, cause hypoxia. And that hypoxia, in turn, triggers resistance mechanisms in the cancer. So almost every patient treated with the drugs I just listed will eventually become resistant to that therapy. And that's a big problem for clinicians. In addition, most of these drugs hit multiple different biochemical targets. They do a lot of different things when you put them into the human body. And some of those things are associated with significant toxicity. Many of these drugs are quite hard for patients to take. And so we do see their use limited in clinical practice by the toxicity profile. EVT-801 brings something very new to this field. It is a very selective VEGFR3 inhibitor. That means two things. It means, first of all, that it's a much cleaner drug, a much more precise drug. It avoids a lot of the toxicity that we see, or we expect it to avoid a lot of the toxicity we've seen with some of these older drugs. But it also means that actually it works primarily by cutting off the lymphatic supply to the cancer. And that should be associated with less hypoxia, less low oxygen levels in the tumor. And that in turn should be associated with lower resistance. And so we expect this drug potentially to be less prone to development of resistance than most of the existing therapies. We've seen these effects demonstrated very, very emphatically in the preclinical work, and it was part of the basis on which we brought into the drug, part of the basis on which we brought the drug into the company. And now, of course, we'll see if that is borne out in the clinical program. So you might say to us, well, is the fundamental thinking here for EVT-801 that it is potentially a better angiogenesis inhibitor than many of the existing therapies? And certainly that is a very reasonable way to approach the drug in a strategic sense. But in many ways, our ambitions are actually much bigger. And I've shown here an important trend in this field. And I've picked out 3 of the more recent anti-angiogenesis drugs. So you also see this class referred to as angiokinase inhibitors. And as you can see, for most of the life of this class, these drugs have been approved as monotherapies for a range of different cancers, but with a particular focus on renal carcinoma, kidney cancer, also liver cancer, thyroid cancer, and so on. So a lot of the focus here has been around using these drugs to inhibit the formation of blood vessels, and that's been a very successful approach in many of the cancers you see here. That thinking has changed very fundamentally in the last 24 months or so. We increasingly see these drugs being used, being approved by FDA for use in combination with immuno-oncology drugs like Keytruda and Opdivo. And this has been a very, very new development in the class. We have seen that these drugs seem to potentiate the activity of these drugs. And as anybody who watches the oncology space will be aware, the advent of these immuno-oncology drugs, Keytruda, Opdivo, Yervoy, Tecentriq, and so on, has been one of the most important developments of the last 10 years or so. These are devastatingly effective therapies, but only in a limited range of cancers, and often only for a limited group of patients within those cancers. In glioblastoma, for example, this class of drugs has been completely ineffective. And part of the reason for that is that the immune system is not very active in some cancers. And the way these drugs work is to channel the immune system against the cancer. If we don't have the right immune cells in the cancer, we have nothing to work with. These angiokinase inhibitors seem to do that. In the parlance of the field, they make cold tumors hot. And 3 of these drugs now have been approved in multiple cancer types to do exactly that. And that's really the trend we want to pick up on with EVT-801. And when we look at the clinical pipeline, when we look at clinical trials ongoing, we see the same trend reflected, a little bit less clearly with axitinib, but certainly with the other 2 therapies. We can see in the last couple of years a huge explosion in clinical trial activity, looking at these drugs not as angiogenesis inhibitors, but as adjuncts to immunotherapy in combination with drugs like Keytruda, Opdivo, and so on. And this really is the big story here. So in many ways, this is a class of therapies where the whole thinking, the whole strategy around the drugs has changed radically in the last 24 months. We've come into what perhaps 2 or 3 years ago would have been regarded as a relatively mature class, but is just on the cusp of a renewed level of interest across the industry. And of course, those who've been with the company for a while may say that you've heard this story before, and you have, because this was exactly the story with paxicillin. When we brought that drug into the company, the PI3K inhibitor class, to which that drug belongs, was perhaps not the most loved or valued class of medicines in oncology. But in the years since, it has radically transformed with multiple approvals, a lot of new learnings and understandings about the PI3K class. And we're just on the cusp of a similar change in thinking, we believe, around the angiokinase class. This is a tremendously exciting time to be developing a new drug in this class of medicines. And we do think EVT-801 has true best-in-class potential here. So we think the prospects for this drug are extremely exciting. And I just put here a little snippet of data. We have hundreds of pages here that I could share, but I'm just going to show this one experiment. This is a mouse model of breast cancer, and as you can see, the gray line here shows untreated mice. The light blue and the red lines show respectively EVT-801 and one of the immuno-oncology therapies, a mouse version of Yervoy. And the drugs by themselves work roughly as well as each other, but when you put them together, it completely shuts down the tumor. We see an 86% reduction in tumor growth. So again, this is not just a pipe dream. This isn't something where we're we're just hoping this will happen. We have strong experimental evidence to support this, and we will now be testing this as we move through the clinical program. And just finally, a picture of what this looks like, very diagrammatic here, and of course it's early days. We're in the phase 1 study now for EVT-801, and we really see two legs to its future development. We remain interested in use of the drug as a monotherapy, as an angiogenesis inhibitor, and we will probably continue to explore that as we move into phase 2. But we also really want, at an early stage, to take the drug into combination with immuno-oncology drugs and really see if this experimental data is borne out there. And we'll be sharing more of that as we progress. Our first priority, obviously, we have to understand the drug in its own right as a monotherapy, but quickly we'll be looking to move it into combination use as the monotherapy study progresses. So, ladies and gentlemen, we really concludes the presentation here. A tremendously exciting time in the company with a lot of really interesting opportunities ahead of us, and be delighted to take some questions now as we move forward. I have one here that's come through, and it's a bit of a point of detail question, but question in relation to our Appendix 4C, which went out recently. The question is, the Appendix 4C describes cash through to the end of 2022, but the numerical part says 2.75 months. And I can briefly talk about that point. When we report the Appendix 4C, it's the standard template requires us to calculate our existing cash on hand divided by our last quarter of expenditure. And that's a calculation that no doubt works for many industries. In our industry, our cash burn is extremely lumpy. And so really our previous quarter is not predictive. When we talk about our cash runway, we talk on the basis of a forward-looking cash flow forecast, which we think is more representative of the company's cash position. So when you see the difference in the 4C, that's what drives it. We have a second question here around the paxilosib studies. Apart from GBM Agile, which of the paxilosib studies should investors pay most attention to? And I think the short answer to that question would be all of them. But I think there are two perhaps I'd single out here. The DIPG study, which is just on the cusp of commencing a phase 2 study with the Pacific Pediatric Neuro-Oncology Consortium, we think is a really interesting study. I think not least because of the extraordinary unmet need in this disease, childhood brain cancer with devastating implications for patients and their families, but also I think for the potential for this to really fast-track paxilosib. This is a rare childhood brain cancer, and I think if we see any glimpse of positive data here as we start to combine paxilosib with other therapies, it could have very profound implications for the potential registration of the drug. So I'd say that's a very interesting study. And I would also perhaps single out the study that's ongoing at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in combination with radiotherapy. This is a ubiquitous way of treating brain cancer. A lot of these patients are treated with radiotherapy. If we can even understand that our drug can be safely combined here, then I think that opens up a great deal more in the way of use cases around the drugs. So I think I'd say that's also an extremely interesting study. But each of these studies really addresses a different use case for paxilosib, a different group of patients. All of them stand to teach us more about the drug, and I think all of them will provide very useful data. We have a question here on that theme that's come through asking around likely timelines of these studies. Now, I will say it's very, very difficult to be precise here. One of the features of the paxilosib program is that the majority of our studies are what we refer to as investigator-initiated studies. That is, they are run and largely funded by the centers that are running them. And that has enabled us to deploy this very, very broad program. But the one potential negative is that it gives us a little bit less visibility and control over timelines than we would have over studies where we run them 100% ourselves. We are expecting readouts from several of, particularly the brain metastases studies, over the next couple of months. We're really ideally expecting to see much of that data by the end of calendar 2022, and we're, as you can imagine, we're pushing the investigators to try and deliver that as quickly as possible, because we're certainly at least as keen to see it as shareholders are. We're also looking forward to seeing final data from the St. Jude DIPG study in the pretty near future. I think they still have a couple of patients in survival follow-up there. And as is often the way with these studies, a longer study is often a better study in the sense that it provides a longer range of follow-up. And then some of the newer studies, the primary CNS lymphoma study, the study that's soon to start at Weill Cornell in combination with ketogenesis. Some of these studies, I think, obviously are at a much earlier stage, and we'll be looking for data probably somewhere in the second half of next year. So I think it spreads out. We continue to expect very, very broadly a quarterly cadence on average to our data readouts, but it'll bunch up. There'll be some busy quarters and some quieter quarters, and of course we'll be sharing that with investors as it comes through. I have a question here about potential combination of paxalosib with EVT-801 and whether that's any part of the company's strategy. And I think the short answer to this question is that it is not at this stage. We do see these programs as very distinct. We certainly don't see EVT-801 particularly as an adjunct to paxalosib. We see it as a standalone program with its own rationale and its own patient population. Not to say that we would never contemplate this. I think there would be a potential scientific rationale to explore it, but I think there's probably other therapies we would look to first to combine with paxalosib. And so I think for the time being, we see EVT-801 and paxalosib as completely separate programs. We've also got a question here about what positive data in some of these, particularly in some of these investigator-initiated studies, could mean for the valuation of the company. And that's something that's really very, very difficult for us to speculate on. I think it's fair to say that even if paxalosib did nothing other than succeed in glioblastoma and achieve the kind of market potential that we've spoken about earlier, it would more than justify, we feel, a substantial premium on its current on the current valuation of the company. So it's very, very difficult to speculate what would be the reception to positive data in these other studies. But I think certainly anything we see here is additive. I don't think there's any sense in which the current value of the company rests on any particular assumptions about the outcome of these investigator-initiated studies. Rather, I think these are opportunities for things to go further. I think for us to expand the value of the paxalosib asset, and it does that partly by pointing to a broader range of patients, and partly by de-risking it, partly by providing, in effect, a safety net to the glioblastoma indications. So certainly, there's no sense in our minds that this is baked in. But exactly how the market chooses to interpret positive data is something that I think any CEO would be reluctant to predict. We have one further question here, which has come through, and it's a question around commercial strategy and whether there is a scenario in which Kazia would consider taking paxalosib to market, whether Kazia would consider taking paxalosib to market itself, whether we would bring the drug to market outside of a commercial partnership. And I think that's a difficult question to answer, in that it's probably a different answer for many territories. Clearly, in territories like Japan or Africa or Latin America, we'd be foolish to try and do that. I think for a small company, that would be a very difficult undertaking. But in the United States, which represents about half of the commercial opportunity for paxilosib, it's not a crazy prospect. This is, as we've seen, a drug which goes some way to marketing itself, just given the enormous need in this disease area, and it's also a disease area which is looked after by a relatively small pool of clinicians. We estimate perhaps around 80 to 100 neuro-oncologists that look after the majority of the patients here, and so it's not crazy for a company in that sort of field to think about launching the drug itself. And there's an argument to say that it represents the best way to deliver value from the asset. I would say that it's not our base case strategy. I would say that I don't think this is something we assume will happen. It's certainly not something we're pursuing to the exclusion of partnering opportunities. I think our expectation is still that a larger company will partner with paxilosib. But I think it's very good for us to have options. I think the best way for us to maximize the value of that partnering transaction is to be in a position where we're not entirely dependent on it. So I think we're probably in that very fortunate position with paxilosib. So I think in terms of the commercial destiny of paxilosib, all options are on the table. And I think we're in the very fortunate position as a company that we do have possibilities to take this drug to market in a range of different ways. And to that point, a question that's come through here is around the likely timing of a partnering transaction. And I think the most direct answer I can give to that question is at any time. We've already partnered the China rights. As I've said, that represents about 8 to 10% of the likely commercial value of the drug. That deal has already been done. We retain about 90+% of the commercial opportunity here, and we can partner that at our leisure. In general, the strategic consideration that underlies this is that the later we partner, the greater the value we stand to realize. But of course, the more investment we have to put into the program and the more risk we bear in doing so. And for any company, the timing of a partnering transaction is something of a balancing act between those two considerations. And I can't say that there's a right answer that can be demonstrated objectively here. I think we continue to have those discussions all the time. There's a number of companies we keep in regular communication with. We share the paxilosib data. I think we're in the happy position that we're not dependent on this transaction occurring in the immediate future. I think we can take our time to get a really good deal rather than necessarily having to generate a quick deal. And so I think this remains an important strand of work for the company. It's something we continue to have regular conversations around, and we consider opportunities as they come. But as I say, I think the great strength of our position is we can afford to do that deal at the right time rather than having to generate a deal at any particular time frame. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll put out a last call for questions there. I think that's all the questions we've had from the attendees so far. If there's anything else that anyone would like to speak to, we have one more that's come in, and a admirably provocative question: could Kazia defend itself against a hostile takeover? I think I'd say this in the topic of M&A opportunities. I think it's a point that no doubt goes through the mind of many shareholders that the company could at some point in the future become a takeover target for a larger company. And I think perhaps our position is that we really only want two things for the company. We want to see both of our drugs move forward towards patients. We believe that we believe in these drugs. We want to see them reach market. We want to see patients benefit from them. And we want to generate value for shareholders, where all the directors and all the employees of the company are ourselves shareholders, but also we feel a very strong sense of responsibility to our shareholders, and we want to generate a good result for them. So if an acquisition of the company satisfies those two objectives, then I think we should consider it, and we should all consider it as shareholders. It's not an outcome we particularly are soliciting at the moment, and I think to do so at our current valuation might perhaps understate the potential opportunity that's embedded in the company. But it's certainly something that would be on the radar for any company in our position, and something we'll consider if and when the time comes.